Welcome. Let's begin as we always do with our passage of the week, then we'll get into the Fog and the Whirlwind, episode 104. Our passage of the week is in the book of Psalms, chapter 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. Selah. And that's Psalms 46, 1 to 3. We live in a day and time where things change. Oftentimes, when things change, fear goes right along with it. You can be afraid of a change in your job, or you could have a change you're going through. Your wife is going through, girlfriend, or your family, your parents. And as your parents age, that does not get better, that gets worse. But the thing that keeps me grounded, the thing that helps me not be afraid, is remembering verses like this, that he is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Not a distant help in trouble. He's present. And then it talks about a number of cataclysmic events, a bunch of things happening, though the earth be removed and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, things like that. Crazy, crazy events. Yet we will trust in the Lord. And it's ultimately because he loves us. Ultimately, it's because we know that he is here with us. He is not an uncaring, cold king that really doesn't really have any sort of desire for us. He doesn't just look on. He's not a deistic God. He is a God who loves his creation and wants what's best for it. And we are very grateful for him. That's how we should live our lives. I really hope that as your life goes on, you seek a close relationship with our Lord and our God. That's an important thing you must do. The Lord Jesus came and died on the cross for your sins. If you have a sense of something being wrong, it's because you have sin in your life. And the Lord died to make a way for you and for me. And so I would challenge you, if you're not reading the Bible, to begin. Start with the book of Matthew. That's a good place to start. And when you're done with that, I would go ahead and read Mark, Luke, and John. And the important thing to do as well is to get with other people. You need to find a church to become a part of, a community to grow up into. So I would challenge you to do that. That's very important. All right, let's get into the show. So, what did I think of this book? Let me hit some big, broad points very quickly before I actually go into any specifics. I liked it. For me, it was a trip down memory lane in many cases. As I was reading some of this stuff, I realized, okay, yeah, that guy's name sounds familiar. Okay, yeah, the concept. All right, yeah, that over there, that's pretty well explained. What exactly am I talking about? Well, there are certain moments that Trump trolled the press that he mentions. He mentions Milo Yiannopoulos as well, talks about him some, and Coulter. And there's some moments brought up in the book that I remember. I remember it happening live. I would say that if you're my age, so I'm 27, I was 18 during the let's see, this would be when I was 17 first in 2015. Then I was 18 in 2016. So I voted November of 16 for Donald Trump. And I would say that if you were born in 1998 or before, you probably don't need to read this book. I still think it would help you. Like, for example, he mentions a couple of people in here. I didn't know about Nigel Farage very much. And then there's another guy. Oh my goodness, what's his name? I can find it. I want to say his last name's Good. And he was another interesting guy, a guy that I've never really read about in any sort of a nuanced way. I can find it here in a minute. But basically, there's a few people in here, really and truly, that I hadn't heard about before. And so I would say that you could probably benefit from it, whether you are my age or younger. But if you're younger than me, you're going to get a whole lot more out of this. We'll just put it that way. Why? Because if you're my age or older, you lived through this. For example, when he writes about Gavin McInnes, you probably remember a Gavin McInnes. Now, you may have been a lib and you didn't actually watch Get Off My Lawn when it was on CRTV and then was acquired by The Blaze and then changed hands again, and he ended up either being let go or fired, depending on what you want to believe. And he's an interesting guy. I'm not a big fan of him. To me, a lot of what he talks about is just kind of basic conservatism, and he tries to act like he's not. So, not a basic conservative, like he's something bigger. And the guy is very funny. Don't get me wrong. The guy is a comedian, definitely. I mean, he can make you laugh. But in terms of political commentary, there wasn't really a whole lot there. But Michael Malice talks about him. So, like I said, I really think that anyone would get something out of this book. But for people that are more like my age and older, it's going to be a trip down memory lane. But you're still going to hear from some people that you weren't particularly familiar with. Like there's a man, an older guy. He's an older Southern gentleman. And let me try and find his name right quick, because now, for the life of me, his name is leaving my brain. So this is, let me find the chapter number. Chapter 13. And there is a gentleman here that Michael Malice sat down with. Okay, yeah. Jared Taylor. Yeah, and I've heard his name very, very rarely. But Michael Malice, a Jew, actually sat down with Jared Taylor and talked to him. And so you have this guy who's known as this big alt-right guy sitting down with Michael Malice, who's an anarchist, who isn't particularly right-wing or left-wing. I don't know, because there's been times Michael Knowles has said to Michael Malice, "Oh, you're a right-winger, right?" And Michael Malice is visibly uncomfortable, goes, what makes you say that? And you can tell he's not really comfortable being labeled right-wing, but he may not necessarily be left-wing either. I will tell you that as you read this book, this is kind of more just general thoughts on this book, that his social liberalism comes out. There's things he says about gays. There's things he says about any number of issues in this book. Immigration's another one, where it comes very clear that this guy, Michael Malice, is actually very socially liberal. He is an anarchist. I have heard him say that he does not consider himself like a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist. I wondered for a while if he was, because he's been on the Tom Woods show several times, and the two of them are very good friends. And also Tom Woods has been on Michael Malice's program, and I think it's been 4 times, something like that. And I love Tom Woods. Y'all know that I still really like him. In fact, whenever you see me go live, I have one of his books sitting next to me. During my live streams, you can see it. It's called Real Dissent. A libertarian sets fire to the index card of allowable opinion. I really wish that he would go back to being a paleo-conservative, though. That's what Tom Woods used to be. He was basic conservative, then paleo-conservative, and then moved over to libertarianism. And even so, I don't have really a problem with him personally. I would differ with his politics for sure, but I really like him. But Malice is different. Malice is definitely socially liberal. He still wants the state to be shrink to nothing. And I like Malice, though. I will say Malice is a very good interviewer. Whenever he has people on his show, you're welcome. He asks very good questions. In his commentary in the book, while I find flaws in it and strong disagreements with certain things he says, particularly about Pat Buchanan, is nevertheless interesting. It at least stimulates thought. And he is someone that's pretty hard-nosed. I mean, he's willing to hang out with Ann Coulter, who is in ways too far right for Fox News. I mean, she didn't used to be. She used to be a darling of pretty much all conservatives. But whenever she sided with Trump first, pretty much the only one at first, in 2016, became one of his biggest cheerleaders. And I don't mean that pejoratively. she was ostracized from a lot of people and then has gone on to say a number of things. Like she said she wouldn't vote for Vivek Ramaswamy because he's Indian. And by the way, I've talked about that at length. You can find, if you go to Spotify or Amazon Music or Audible, and it should be on Substack too. I've talked about those comments that she made, and she actually covered it in a very cultural and nuanced way along religious lines that I thought was very interesting and insightful, and not in a way that was just like, "Oh, you're brown, I don't like." No, she actually went into the history, and so she's a very intelligent person. And I also have a number of her books as well, sitting next to Pat Buchanan's books. I'm not a culture-right. I think she's way too hawkish on foreign policy, but I think that she's really good on immigration and some social issues. So anyway, he also, on that note, Michael Malice talks a good bit about her, and so you have Michael Malice sitting down with her, as I said, and with other people that are to the right of her by a long shot, and he's pretty comfortable with them. Michael Malice is not really a chameleon per se, but he's able to get along with people. He's hard-nosed enough where if someone hits him with some facts, he's able to either counter or at least stand in the face of it. He's not going to shrink back or back down, and I respect him on that. I disagree a lot with him, but I respect him. And this book is good because of the different people that he interviews. I think it benefits the reader. The reader can then read these people's opinions and say, okay, well, that was different. That was interesting. On the note about Buchanan, so this is pretty early on into the book. This was very interesting. I didn't know this, but back in, oh man, is this like chapter 3? Let me find it right quick. I believe it might actually be later into the book. There's a chapter where Michael actually mentions an opinion by Rush Limbaugh that I thought was kind of interesting, because Rush Limbaugh said something about Pat Buchanan. You know, Rush Limbaugh was someone that I really liked growing up because he was funny and owned the libs, and I thought would stand up to him, stuff like that. Truth be told, he didn't exactly really present a better opinion than you would get on like Fox News. And looking at him now, I think you can have nuance and say, look, he was anti-left, and that's great, that's funny, but he wasn't particularly hardcore right-wing, definitely not on foreign policy. On other issues, was he not? Did he do more harm than good? That's kind of a hard one. I would argue he probably did more good than harm, but by it's a close one. It's like 51-49 or something, because no one was beating the war drum harder than Rush Limbaugh. Then maybe, the only other person might be like Sean Hannity or Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. But this was interesting. So one thing that Michael Malice does in this book, and this is still in, I just had it, I think it said chapter 4. I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's chapter 3. He looks a lot at the Paleo Alliance throughout this entire book. Michael Malice comments on the Paleo Alliance between the Paleo Conservatives and the Paleo Libertarians. And it was interesting because the Paleo Conservatives disagree with the Libertarians on economics, but on a lot of cultural issues they agreed. And even some of the Paleocons, while being right-wing, didn't want the government to necessarily enforce morality. So they were friends with Paleo-Libertarians on that stance. And they were also both anti-war. But as time went on, this sort of frazzled, and eventually the alliance wore out and went away. It ended up breaking up in some sense. So this was interesting. There's something that I wanted to read here. This is on page 53, but again, chapter 3. Rothbard, this is again in the Paleo Alliance, found himself courting the same types of people who had venerated Strom Thurmond in 1948. I'm going to stop right here and say, you guys really need to read that book, Annals of the Stupid Party by Clyde N. Wilson, because he talks about Strom Thurmond in, I think, is a very balanced way. Lindsey Graham actually stepped into Strom Thurmond's shoes when he became senator of South Carolina, and that was a significant downgrade. Thurmond was by no means perfect. He liked to chase tail, but he was way better than Lindsey Graham, even though he had been a Democrat before. So anyway, back to the book, Strom Thurmond in 1948. His old buddy, Ron Paul, seemed to agree with this approach. Ron Paul's political report featured several eyebrow-raising turns of phrase, such as the claim that order was only restored in L.A. after the 1992 riots when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks 3 days after rioting began, end quote. Rothbard also saw fit to, if not exactly champion, ex-Klansman David Duke, at least denounce his critics. That a former KKK official's sincerity would be in doubt seems shocking to Rothbard. It took a campaign of slander that resorted to questioning the sincerity of Duke's conversion to Christianity. End quote. One wonders how Rothbard would have grappled with the repentant Mr. Duke's 2003 book, Jewish Supremacism, My Awakening to the Jewish Question, which included the claim that Jews literally shapeshifted to fit in among the Christians. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, both Rothbard and Buchanan decided. So it was Rothbard came on board the 1992 Buchanan presidential campaign. Buchanan remained a pro-labor religious protectionist. Pat Buchanan is not a conservative, Rush Limbaugh would later insist. He's a populist, end quote. Rothbard was still an anarchist opposed to the government always and in all ways. Both were far more united in what they were against, namely progressivism in all its form, than in what they were for. But both also shared a complete contempt for the political establishment left and right. Both presaged the new right in its entirety, end quote. So I want to put that down for a second and just say, this is interesting because here you have Rush Limbaugh, who is sort of conservative, sort of not. And to him, I should say, Pat Buchanan is not a conservative. He's a populist. Now, all things being equal, do I consider Pat Buchanan to be a populist? Sort of. I mean, he's a right-wing populist if he's to be considered a populist at all. I would consider him more of a paleo conservative. And I don't think that that's unreasonable or unfair. I think that it's perfectly fine to look at his moral stances and his stances on trade and say, okay, did he have a stance on trade that a lot of populists would agree with? Sure. But that's an old school conservative stance. Old conservatives were hawkish on trade. They wanted fair trade, not free trade. It was as time went on with the Bushes in particular, but even probably it had its beginnings with Reagan. Or you could probably make the argument maybe Ford that started to change. That it became all about, free trade, deregulate everything. It was before that. I mean, when you look at, okay, this was the party of Teddy Roosevelt. We were the party of Teddy Roosevelt that was hawkish on the economy, on making sure everyone had a square deal. I mean, that was what Teddy Roosevelt famously ran on when he ran independent. He ran with the Bull Moose movement, the Progressive Party, I think was what he called it at first. Which, okay, yeah, did that end up getting co-opted by leftists, and has that term been hijacked by leftists? This is something I've kind of talked about at times. What I've talked about, the neo-reactionary trichotomy. The people that stand up for the working man, the real people that do that, are the so-called right-wing populists and the nationalists. They're the ones that actually do. These commie types will act like they do, but they don't. They actually support the government getting so much power and so much wealth that they end up screwing the little guy even more, right? And again, I don't really identify as a populist. I agree with some of their policies when it makes sense. And I can expound on that in the future. But that's the thing. The term progressive originated in the Republican Party. Do you have any idea if Teddy Roosevelt, where does this come from? That Teddy Roosevelt would support trans rights or gay marriage? Heck no. And he was hawkish against Russia, and there were certain wars that he got involved with. The man loved militarism and war, sure. I'm willing to accept that. So in ways, he was a little bit neocon on that. But the man was very much a populist and a real progressive, and in a good way. That term has been co-opted by leftists who really are trying to talk a good game about being populist and then force feed everyone trans rights and liberal values. And the problem, too, is whenever these people get in power, they inevitably get corrupted very quickly. And to be fair, there's plenty of people on the right that get corrupted very quickly as well. But a prime example of this is AOC. She had all this promise of going in looking like a left-wing populist, and even her own voters are mad at her because she's taking the big PAC money. And of course, there's people on the right that take big PAC money. That's not the point. One thing I think that's important to look at here is something in this chapter. It mentions Ross Perot, so I want to talk at some point, probably either in a video from my YouTube channel, Rumble channel, about Ross Perot, my thoughts on Perot. But anyway, one thing that I did not like is that apparently Hoppe, Michael Malice quotes Hoppe here, referred to Buchanan as either a social nationalist or a national socialist. which is such a dumb liberal thing to do. Like, why would you do that? Why in the world would you treat a good man like Pat Buchanan that badly? It's preposterous that you would refer to Pat Buchanan as a national socialist. And speaking of people that are disgusting, there are also quotes here from William F. Buckley. Let's look at Buckley for a second. So William F. Buckley. We're going to talk about William F. Buckley, then move on to other parts. But William F. Buckley, for those of you who don't know, ran a TV show where he would interview people. He was a conservative, so-called, commentator, mainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you can look up old footage of his TV interviews, the people that he talks to. Well, he had on Buchanan, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what Buchanan did. It's worth noting that a big moment for me whenever I started to realize how fake and gay and woke Con Inc. is, including, but not limited to, the Daily Wire, was a moment when I was listening to Michael Malice talk to Michael Knowles. So Michael Knowles, I assume it's just called The Michael Knowles Show. Michael Knowles has a show, and he invited Michael Malice on it. And they were having a discussion. It was a pretty good discussion. The two of them kind of like triggering the libs. It was a funny little conversation. But at one point, Michael Malice brought up Buckley's name in a negative way, and Knowles said, "Really? I really like Buckley." And you could tell from the look on Malice's face that he was really surprised to hear this and said, Buckley is a big villain of conservatism. He was a gatekeeper. He kicked multiple people out of the conservative movement because they were too right-wing for him. Really? And Knowles, I don't even remember what he said back, just something shallow and silly, I suppose. But that's the kind of commentary you get from Michael Knowles. And I've brought this up several times, but I'm bringing it up now because it's relevant. Most conservatives don't realize what I'm about to tell you. So there's a National Review article in 2015 titled Why We Should Recognize Same-Sex Marriage. This is just kind of something Malice brings up to show how the right moves toward the middle, or conservative movement in general. So there's some things that were written here. Buckley basically devoted an entire issue of National Review to an essay lambasting Buchanan titled In Search of Anti-Semitism, which he expanded into a short book the following year. So what does this have to do with? I'm reading the book right here now. Buckley and Buchanan wrote a 1990 New York Post article questioning some aspects of Holocaust history. Nixon went on the air to defend Buchanan, insisting that he's not an anti-Semite, which was fairly indisputable proof that he was. Holocaust denial is far more often couched as Holocaust skepticism, just asking questions, and Buckley was having none out of it. Then it goes on to say what I just told you. He devoted an entire issue of National Review to an essay lambasting Buchanan titled In Search of Anti-Semitism, which he expanded into a short book the following year. This one went on, Michael Malice writes, so it was that by 1991, both Rothbard and Buchanan were pariahs in their own way and had nothing to lose. It seemed inevitable that George H.W. Bush would be the Republican nominee again. In the wake of the Gulf War, he had posted approval ratings of around 90%, an unprecedented number. It also seemed rather certain that Bush would be reelected, as no one on the Democratic side had anything close to his political stature. So that is how Buckley treated Buchanan. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because there's a difference. I really do believe there is a difference between looking at specifics of the Holocaust, saying, okay, how many of these people died of typhus and how many of them died because they were murdered or just killed because they were in combat, things like that. Because a number of people in the Russian army were Jewish. Not really that many, very few. You see way more people in leadership in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that were Jewish than you do actually see foot soldiers, but there were some. But it's one thing to ask questions about, okay, how many of them died of typhus and what were the actual numbers, and do some history, do some deep digging and some reading. But it's impossible to do so when you live in a culture, when you live under a regime that smashes you down and says you cannot question anything. Oftentimes, we're told here on the right that the Nazis stopped all political discourse, that the Nazis were censorious, that if you dare to say anything they didn't like, you were questioned or arrested or sent to a work camp or killed. And yet, when you look at the regime we live under right now, when you look at the gay race communist regime we're under, the liberal progressive new world order that we're living under, it sounds a lot like a regime that we were told about in our history class when we covered World War II. We're often told this is what fascism and National Socialism are, when really, when you put on the they live glasses, you realize, no, we're actually living that right now. If you say the wrong thing, you get fired. If you say the wrong thing, you can get debanked. Mark Andreessen has talked to Joe Rogan about that. Now, of course, I believe in the Bible, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. There are people that are evil, who are provocative for its own sake, who do things like tell 1488 jokes in poor taste. Not to say that we can't have a dark sense of humor and laugh about it as a joke, not as something that we hold to as, oh, this is truth. But there are people in bad taste that should be condemned and not really taken seriously because they're just kind of these edgelords on Gab or even some of these edgelord types on Twitter. But when you look at this book I read just a bit ago, these are Michael Malice's words, there is fairly indisputable proof that Pat Buchanan was an anti-Semite. And this is more name-calling. This is just more stuff that is just the same. This is one of the reasons I don't really call myself like a Michael Malice anarchist, and I am not an anarchist of any kind or a libertarian of any kind, but I don't particularly consider myself an admirer of Michael Malice. I think he can be very funny. But it's also not particularly surprising he's going to say this, because all you got to do is look up Michael Malice's heritage. Yeah. So with that being said, that was the interaction between Pat Buchanan and William F. Buckley, how he was treated. Now, this is something else that I wanted to cover. We're going to now move on from Buckley and talk a little bit more about Buchanan. So Buchanan, in his book, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because Malice actually talks a lot about Buchanan here. Malice is very critical. Excuse me. 1 second. Malice is very critical of Buchanan. He doesn't like the fact that he has the views that he holds to on immigration. And there's not really any good reason given, I will add. There really isn't. Whenever you read this book, you will ask yourself, okay, Malice, I understand that you disagree with Pat Buchanan's views on immigration. But why? What is your positive case for the alternative? The only thing you could sort of say would be, all right, well, are you just saying to basically listen to people smarter than you? People like, oh, what's his name? Brian Kaplan, who I don't agree with when it comes to immigration at all, but he's a smart guy. He's an economist, and he makes his case for open borders, and you could agree with it or disagree with it. Of course, I strongly disagree with it. But Michael Malice doesn't actually make cases. I mean, he says some things to critique Buchanan, but doesn't actually make the positive case for why we should basically have no government-controlled borders and allow multiple people to come in here. So I wanted to read this part. This is in, oh boy, let me find the chapter of this part of the book. So this is, okay, almost there. Sorry, guys. Chapter 9 of the book. Death of the West is a book that Pat Buchanan wrote. I actually have it. Michael Malice says here, as such, it's very hard to critique a right-wing book that is actually crackpot, simplistic, and outdated without sounding like a leftist. I want to pause here and say that Michael Malice's critiques of this do sound like a leftist, and you're going to see what I'm talking about. To continue with what Michael Malice is saying, yet Death of the West, again, this is by Pat Buchanan, is all those things to a great extent, combined with spot-on analysis and insight. Like so much else of the new right, it's very much a mixed bag. To begin with, Buchanan repeatedly uses a trick to make claims without taking the responsibility of making them. The use of rhetorical questions that are anything but. This is a quote from Buchanan. Is Western civilization about to follow Linden's empire to the same inglorious end? End quote. Quote, are we in the twilight of the West? End quote. Buchanan wonders. Without waiting for an answer, he quickly assumes the positive and then asks, is the death of the West irreversible? End quote. So let's stop right here. Without waiting for an answer, Michael Malice says, he quickly assumes the positive and then asks, is the death of the West irreversible? You will find, though, even in the course of this chapter of The New Right by Michael Malice, that Pat Buchanan is making his case. He asks, are we about to follow Linden's empire to the same inglorious end, and are we in the twilight of the West? And Malice is like, well, now you're assuming it's true when you say, is the death of the West irreversible? Well, Pat Buchanan makes his point, and a lot of it is declining birth rates. And he goes on to continue to write about this, and I'm going to read it to you. But American birth rates have not gotten better. They've gotten worse. I mean, I've talked to you guys that the numbers used to be 3.4. The numbers now are 1.9. Now, if every couple in America, if every man and woman married has 2 children, 1 man, 1 boy, and 1 girl, and let's just say they both grow up to get married, do some basic math. That's basically replacement immigration, assuming that they grow up, they get married, and they have children, and have 2 more. Okay, we're now treading water. We're not swimming under, but we're treading water, which is not really good. We need to be having more children to grow our population. But that would be replacement. But 1.9 means there are some that are only having 1. And again, 1.9 is the average. There are several having 1 child or 0. And then there are some that are having 3, 4. I'm in a family of 4. I know people who are in a family of 10. There's some people I know who have a family of 18. They have 18 children. And this guy is impregnating this woman 18 times. And she keeps having children. And God bless them. I think that's a wonderful thing to have a lot of children. This is not at all saying that anyone should force anyone to have children or to have more than 1 child. But it's something that is worth looking at and asking, why are we having less children? And I've talked about this before in the past. I talk about this in my review of Michael Warren Davis's book. I really do believe that some of it is economic. I don't think it's only cultural. I definitely think that abortion is in a lot of ways to blame. I think that a culture of me and I and my is also a problem. Oh, I need to do what I want, and I'll have children later when I'm in my 30s, and I can only have 1 or 2 before I basically have no more fertility. That's a bit of a different situation. You know, that's one thing. But I do believe that there's an economic angle of the man cannot just work 1 job and make enough money to feed his family. He's got to work 2 minimum, sometimes 3, for the wife to be able to stay home. And in many cases, what they end up doing is he works his job, she goes out on maternity leave, has her children, or her 1 child in some cases, puts the child in daycare, and then goes back to work so that they can make ends meet. That is a problem. That's something that I want to talk about, as I've said to you guys, more this year, the economic problems of this country. I have a lot of interest in trying to figure out what's going on. Why are things so weird with our economy where wages continue to fall? Now, they grew under Donald Trump. That's one thing that a lot of leftists cannot stand, and they really have no data against this. But you can find very easily stats on rising wages, and you will see they rose during Trump's term. They stopped that in 2020 for obvious reasons. COVID-19 was terrible for the world, not just the economy in America. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but Buchanan is not building up an argument on nothing. He is making an argument, and Malice is just rejecting it. So let's go on now to actually get into some more of this. So here we go. Michael Malice writes, Buchanan's logic is remarkably similar to that of Al Gore and his global warming associates. It breaks down like this. 1. Civilization is under unprecedented existential threat. 2. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society, which is admittedly impossible. 3. Since our political systems won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least effect incremental changes in the right direction. 4. Said changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason, we should do them anyway. Okay, we'll stop. I'm going to stop Michael Malice right there, and I'm going to respond to this a little bit. So, civilization is under unprecedented existential threat. It should be reasonable, in many people's minds anyway, half the country, to say that the idea of the world getting hotter on data that is shaky, on data that the man who started the Weather Channel rejects, that is different than the fact that people are having less children at not even replacement levels. One is fear-mongering that might actually have some truth to it. There's people like Curtis Yarvin who say that he's what is he called, like a lukewarmist. He thinks that the world is getting hotter, but it's not. It's kind of inconsequential to human life. It's not really going to affect us that much. That's more or less what Glenn Beck says at one point. He talks about all the millions of people that die of hypothermia every year and says if the world actually does get a little bit warmer, even if it did, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. I really don't believe. I'm full-blown denier over here. I really don't believe that it's actually getting worse. I think it's all a big pattern. That things get warmer, then things get colder. That's my viewpoint on it. So people should be able to see the distinction between, okay, this over here, which has to do with the weather, going to wipe out the human race. Oh, no, to the fact that birth rates are declining and that we're not going to have a country, we're not going to have a nation if people stop having children. If people go from having 1.9 to 1 or 0.9 or 0.5, meaning the rate drops down so much that the average is 0, but then there's some outliers who have like 5 or 6, and that brings it up a little bit. And then most people only have one kid only. You know, if numbers continue to fall, we will have a collapsing population. That is a fact. When we look at the numbers, things have gone down with the population and the number of kids people are having. So Michael Malice is trying to draw a false equivalency. He's looking at an apple and an orange and saying, well, they're both fruit, when he should be saying, no, these are two different things completely. All right, so point 2, this is back to the book. This is what Malice is saying, Buchanan is saying. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society, which is admittedly impossible. So 2 and 3 go together. Let me go ahead and read 3. Since our political systems won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least effect incremental changes in the right direction. Okay, part of when you stop being a boy and grow up to be a man, in other words, when you stop being a libertarian and move toward the right wing, is realizing how politics actually work. This is one issue, and I try not to do too much right-wing infighting here, but this is one issue that I sort of have with Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin, in his discussion with Christopher Rufo, said a lot of really good things. I probably agree a little bit more with him on certain things than I do with Rufo. I don't particularly like either one of them as far as, do I consider myself a Mold Buggy? And no. Do I consider myself a Rufo? And no, I don't. But at the same time, there were things that Yarvin said, which is you've got to just change your whole paradigm of thinking. You're not becoming radical enough, Rufo. There's an element of that is true. Where I would have problems with Yarvin is he does have the mindset. Rufo pointed this out correctly. Yarvin has the mindset of if you do anything to fight this monster, they'll just beat you. And so Rufo says, I see that this as like a excuse for inaction, because your lesson that you're teaching your listeners is when you fight your enemies, they win. And so what logic are you supposed to come to? What conclusion are you supposed to come to other than, well, then just don't fight? And then the other thing that Yarvin says is we basically have to just take over everything, somehow have a dictator come in. And I don't mean even dictator in a negative way. I mean like a king come in here and just sweep everything away, fix everything. And that in the meantime, any kind of incremental change doesn't really do anything because he critiques the incremental change that Rufo makes. In reality, I think you can take some of both. I think that we need to have some small changes. You have to start somewhere. There has to be some incremental change. You have to walk before you can run. And what's an example of this? It took years of these pro-life organizations talking and talking and talking, and I'm sure countless meetings that they spent with Donald Trump. And then what happened? I mean, you're talking about ever since Roe v. Wade came about. But then what happens? All their hard work eventually paid off. All their time spent with Donald Trump, and eventually he chooses Supreme Court justices. He's looking at them and saying, you know what? I'm going to choose this person, this person, and this person. And what do? They get in there and they overturn Roe v. Wade. You have got to move in small steps first. You have to. The idea of one day we're going to just snap our fingers and everything, like, with Thanos' gauntlet, is just going to melt away all our problems, is fantastical. And so, so this is the thing. So now we're looking at 3 and 4. So let's look at all 3, 2, 3, and 4. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society. Again, I'm reading Malice's words about Buchanan, which is admittedly impossible. Since our political system won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least affect incremental changes in the right direction. Said changes won't, this is 4 now, said changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason, we should do them anyway. So the 4th one, here is where Malice is right, and here's where he is wrong. So where he is right is a lot of people make incremental changes, very small ones, and that's enough. They are content to stop right there. This is part of the problem with conservatives. Conservatives will get into office, lower taxes. They may do a little bit on foreign policy that's marginally better than what the Democrats are doing, maybe if you're lucky. And then they just are content to be right there. Say, well, we've reversed a little bit. We're making incremental change, and we're content to stop right there. They won't stop. What it needs to be is exponential. Incremental change squared, incremental change squared, just on and on and on. It needs to be exponential. Because what happens is like a snowball. That snowball is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so he is right when he says these changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason, we should do them anyway. So the reason we should do them anyway is because at the starting point, slowing down the car from going off the cliff is not a bad thing. So the whole thing about, conservatives are progressives driving the speed limit is correct. Conservatives are not nearly enough. I cover this in depth when I read The Reactionary Mind by Michael Warren Davis and review it, and also acknowledge the Stupid Party by Clyde M. Wilson, and go on to say that I'm no longer consider myself to be a conservative because it's not good enough. So those are legit critiques that these people are just driving the speed limit. But before you stop the car, at some point when you press the brakes, you are going to drive the speed limit. If you're going 90 and you press the brakes and you're in a 55, at some point the speedometer is going to say 55. But you don't stop there. That's the difference. The conservatives say, we're going 55, we're good. Whereas we want to not only stop this car, but put it into reverse. We want a turning back of the clock here on the right. So we've got to start somewhere. And so this idea, this straw man of, we should do them anyway, even though it won't actually stop this. Well, if you reverse things from being, the birth rate, from being 1.9, you bring it to 2.9 or 3.9, you are moving in the correct direction. Now, where does it need to hover? It needs to hover above replacement levels, really, and probably well above that, so we can continue to grow and have a big population of European-descended old stock Americans. So let's go on into now a little bit more. I wanted to cover those 4 points Malice makes that are really straw men, trying to conflate two things that are completely different. And let me continue. Continuing this section about Buchanan and Michael Malice. Michael Malice writes on, for Gore, civilization consists of the entire world, whereas for Buchanan, civilization is largely synonymous with the West. Other than that, the logic is pretty much identical. And again, I would have strong disagreements with this. To go back to the text, whereas for Gore, death is a function of the weather, for Buchanan, it's a matter of the wrong people outbreeding the right ones. Buchanan anticipates this objection and addresses it. So this is Buchanan talking now. Is the death of the West inevitable? Or like all previous predictions of Western decline and demise, will this cup too pass away and expose as fools all who say we must drink it? Why do predictions of the death of the West not belong on the same back shelf as the predictions of nuclear winter and global warming? Answer. The death of the West is not a prediction of what is going to happen, it is a depiction of what is happening now. First world nations are dying. They face a moral crisis. They face a mortal crisis, not because of something happening in the third world, but because of what is not happening at home and in the homes of the first world. Western fertility rates have been falling for decades. So let me just pause right here and react to what he just said. How can anyone disagree with this? And you're going to see in a minute, well, some people do. But first world nations are dying. When you look at United Kingdom, when you look at Germany, when you look at France, even Spain, and all these old European countries. And the whole thing, let me pause right here. The whole thing is like Malice is saying, Buchanan, it's a matter of the wrong people outbreeding the right ones. I don't really give a crap if people in the Congo and Africa have 20 children. Again, there used to be a lot of people having that many children in Europe. I mean, in Europe and in America, you can look at, for example, oh gosh, I think it was Paul Revere. He had so many children. Now, the problem was, too, you had a lot of infant mortality, and they didn't know how many of them were going to continue to live because you could die of a childhood disease or die at birth. So that was part of the logic. But also, they saw children as a gift from God and they didn't have birth control. So if you were having sex, logically, you could pretty much know that you were going to get pregnant, right? So the whole thing about, wrong people operating the right ones, it's like, no, I really don't care. People in other countries have a lot of kids. But the problem is, if we didn't have open borders, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. If we didn't have amnesty, including, by the way, from Republican presidents like Reagan and Bush, Sr. and Jr., really. But, and again, did Trump deport enough people? No, not in his first term. He's doing some better this time. That's a completely separate argument about Trump's efficacy in his second term. But the point is, this idea of the wrong people outbreeding the right ones, well, but when you've got falling birth rates in this country and people are saying, well, for us to not have a falling birth rate, we really need to bring in some illegals, you have to understand that even if we were at replacement levels or above, they would still want to bring in a whole bunch of immigrants because it's about supplanting us from our own home, the place that we've called home for over 200 years, right? And bringing in a bunch of people that they can manipulate, that they can use against us. They can whip into a frenzy and cause a race war and so forth. So, and also, it's weird that he would phrase this way, but it's not particularly surprising. It's not, the way that it's phrased is, the wrong people versus the right one. It's like, okay, if your word for the people that built this country, the people that crossed over on the Mayflower, had children, hit the rock, had children, and continue to have children, and their children's children, and so on. If you want to call those the right people, that's kind of a narrow, strange way to look at it, Michael Malice. I kind of understand what you're saying. Like, literally, maybe that's sort of what Buchanan is saying. But the argument is not about, wrong people versus right people. It's like, no, the people that are foreigners versus the people that have lived here for 200 and something years. Or in my case, it's been over 100 years. I mean, my country has roughly been here, has roughly been here for, it's got to be about 100 years. I think they came here in about 1908 on my father's side. My mother's side, they've been here way before then. I mean, you're talking, and that's generally my dad's dad. My dad's mom had been here since well before 1908. They've been in Alabama, my dad's mom. And then my mom's parents have been in Texas. And then I think one of them came up from somewhere in New England. So with that being said, we've been here for at least a couple hundred years, maybe even longer, on most sides of my family. Again, one of them, though, came from Sweden. I've mentioned my Swedish blood before, and came in the early 1900s, very early. I mean, you're talking about I'm 27, so you're talking about my great-great-grandfather. So, yeah, I mean, my great-grandfather, my dad's grandfather, died when I was really young. I mean, I was alive, but barely. And then they're talking about his dad, so great-great-grandfather. And so that's the other thing people bring up. I mentioned this recently in a video I did responding to Sam Cedar, this concept of a melting pot. And it's like, yeah, but it was a melting pot of European people. And again, Michael Malice, if you want to call these people the right people, so-called, Okay, but the argument is that's the people that built this country, and we shouldn't bring in a bunch of people to change that because it's created a pretty darn good result. I mean, these people creating this country has created a really good result. All right, so to continue here with what Michael Malice is saying about Western fertility rates have been falling for decades. That's what Buchanan says. Malice goes on to reply, because Death of the West was written in 2001, Buchanan makes several claims that can now actually be checked against the data. For example, he points out that in 2000, Russia's birth rate has already plummeted to 1.17 children below Italy's. Its population had fallen to 145 million. One estimate had it headed to 123 million by 2015. Surely there was also an estimate that would have been a much higher number, but Buchanan chooses to end on the more alarmist figure. In fact, the 2017 figure has Russia's population, sans Crimea, at 144 million, approximately where it was in 2000. The idea that Russia's worldwide influence or vitality is somehow weaker now than it was during the Clinton years is untrue. After all, the Kremlin now controls both Moscow and the White House. Ha ha ha. Okay, yeah, you know you're making a joke there. He's pretty funny. I mean, Michael Malice can be very funny. And again, whenever he says things like that, it's with a smile. He's not actually saying that the Kremlin controls the White House. He's trying to make you laugh and succeeding. Okay, but with that being said, so let's address this about Russia. As long as you're correct, I don't particularly care about the timeline. If you say, oh, and the other thing is, okay, but Buchanan is citing these numbers. Well, Miles will say, well, I know, but these numbers he's citing were incorrect. Look, Russia's population is the same. So there's a couple things that have happened. One thing, and this you can see this, by the way, or find this out if you listen to things like the Daryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson podcast that they've remarked upon, is countries that did not have liberalism as their government for, let's just say, 1918 to 1991. So the Soviet Union. It was under something probably just as bad, although there's arguments to the contrary that are very compelling. Because liberalism is a soft version in many ways of leftism, but because it's softer, it's easy to pretend that it's somehow better, and it's not. It really is either the same bad or worse, because the devil you don't know sometimes is way worse than the devil you do know. Communism, we know. At this point, we know liberalism too, but at the time we didn't. We thought liberal democracy was a good thing. And this goes for conservatives as well. So that being said, what am I saying? These countries in Eastern Europe were not affected by liberalism. Free sex, free drugs, yada, yada, yada. That wasn't the case in the Soviet Union. There were problems, for sure, economically especially. And in many cases, Christians were killed and persecuted, but they didn't have liberalism. Well, and that's one thing that's worth noting, is whenever the wall came down, Berlin, so this would have been East Berlin, got flooded with pornography. Why? Makes you think, doesn't it? But these countries have not had all these things, all these amenities, or this culture that we've had. And as a result, have been functioning in a lot of ways like a third world country, even though they're not. They're really still considered a first world country. But the other thing that's worth noting about Russia is Russia has a lot of rural areas. You've got Moscow and Novosibirsk and St. Petersburg, sure. But a lot of other parts of Russia are very rural, and rural people tend to have more children. And people out in the middle of nowhere, they tend to have more kids. And so that's another reason. But even so, the other thing about this that Malice will not admit is Russia has an immigration problem too. And you can hear this from Fyodor Shinrin, or is it Shirin? I think it's Shirin, who has the channel Be Fluent in Russian. He's mentioned more than once that there's an illegal immigration problem that Russia has. So this idea that their population is 145, not so sure. Not so sure that reflects accurate numbers. Particularly, though, I would point to the fact that liberalism hasn't been in Russia very long. It's been there for a little while by this point. By 2025, it's been there since roughly 1991. They've had kind of like a liberal democracy in some ways. because they have elections and things like that. Now, Putin is not really a liberal, particularly like a liberal. He's more of like a conservative or a neoconservative. I've talked to certain Russian people, and that's their viewpoint on it. He has certain populist tendencies, but most Russian populists would say not enough. And I'll talk about Russia in more depth at some point. So to go back to what Buchanan is saying and Michael Malice is responding to, is there a parallel between dying Christianity in the West and the death of Japan's pre-war and wartime faith? Buchanan asks. When nations lose their sense of mission, their mandate of heaven, the faith that brought them into this world as unique countries and cultures, is that when they die? Is that when civilizations perish? So it would seem, Malice says. In fact, that's not how it would seem in the slightest. It was partly the faith of the Japanese and Emperor Hirohito divinity that convinced Truman to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was also why getting the emperor to renounce his claim to be a godman was such an important part of the surrender. Absolutely, much of pre-World War II Japanese culture has gone by the wayside, but Japan as such has not perished in any sense. To claim that the world's largest creators and consumers of tentacle rape pornography are somehow no longer a unique country and culture beggars belief. It was losing its faith that permitted Japan to become a civilized world power, not a progressive egalitarian world power either. So let me just pause right here. Look at this insane claim. Michael Malice says, well, because these are the largest creators and consumers of tentacle rape pornography, this is a unique culture, a unique country. Like what? Did you actually make that claim, Michael? That's crazy. The idea that having a religious ceremony with the tea that you drink, or a prayer to start your day, and other capital T traditions in Japan, those might be going by the wayside. Again, they're still existing in some form with especially the older crowd. But then Michael Malice is like, well, don't really worry about that because they're making some good porn. That is insane. And one of the weirdest things I've heard, and full of sin too, which he's not a Christian, so it's no big surprise. So back to the text here. The richer a nation becomes, insists Buchanan, the fewer its children, and the sooner it begins to die. Society is organized to ensure the maximum pleasure, freedom, and happiness for all their members are at the same time advancing the state of their own funerals. End quote. So this is Malice talking now. But Buchanan doesn't bother to name a single nation that actually has died. The most recent major nation to have a funeral, was the Soviet Union, and this was due neither to its wealth nor its aging population. In fact, if the Soviets had more money than they likely could have held on for far longer, as part of the Reagan stratagem was to force the USSR to spend itself into bankruptcy and systemic collapse. Iraq, in one sense, said to have died, but to claim that this was due to the maximum pleasure, freedom, and happiness for all Iraqis is also absurd. Malice goes on to write, one of the problems with Buchanan, he has in parentheses in Rothbard, is that he often reads things into politicians that aren't really there. It is a common approach, as seen with the cathedral's veneration of candidate Obama and the new right's early hopes for Trump. Yet politics is rarely that straightforward or that linear, and after serving under Nixon, Buchanan should have known better. Instead, he ended up writing paeans to the new right's bête noire, Angela Merkel. Let me pause right here. I'm going to go into this in the future, but Nixon is very unfairly maligned. That guy was really trying to become an Article 2 executive, which is what the Founding Fathers intended, to actually wield political power over, guess what, the executive branch. And it's not a big surprise that Malice doesn't like Nixon, because he's saying, oh, he should have known that serving under Nixon, that politics were that straightforward or that linear. And I understand that. I get what he's sort of saying, but Malice does not look on Nixon favorably, you can tell from reading this book, nor is it a particular surprise. To go on here, this is now what Buchanan is saying. This is Malice quoting Buchanan. The German Christian Democratic Party leader Angela Merkel already appears to be moving to capitalize on the backlash against Islamic immigration, Buchanan declared. Inviting Turkey to become a candidate for the European Union membership was a mistake, he quotes her as saying. There are differences of value. We do not have the same understanding of human rights. Try opening a Christian church in Istanbul, end quote. Contemporary Germany is regarded as ground zero for the alleged Muslim invasion of Europe. This is now Michael Malice talking. Along with Sweden and France, Germany, specifically Merkel's Germany, is always held up by the new right as what to avoid as a model. Not only is Merkel committed to bringing in even more immigrants, but leaders of German opposition parties are even advocating extending voting rights to them, something members of the new right feel is downright suicidal and insane. Breitbart and other outlets constantly point out how all the migrants being brought into Germany are not assimilating at all. This is a headline. Tens of thousands of migrants in Germany unable to read or write. Here's another headline. Migrant convicted of sexually abusing 10-year-old received asylum status despite known critical history. Articles from mainstream outlets are shared in new right circles without any comment necessary, such as one Metro article that begins, "A woman in Germany has created anti-rape shorts," which began as a personal project after she was attacked while out running. By far the biggest scandal and cautionary tale in new right circles was the huge number of sexual assaults that occurred in Cologne, or is it Cologne? I've heard it both ways, and other German cities on December the 31st, 2015 into the night. The claim was that these attacks, overwhelmingly by non-Aryans, were deliberately kept out of the press by the German government lest there be racist reaction. All right, so let's pause right here and try to address a little bit of this. So I've had Endeavor on my podcast. I've talked before about the people that really started moving me rightward away from libertarianism. There were several. Pete Quinones played the biggest role, probably. Some of it was also just what I saw with my eyes during COVID-19 in 2020 and early 2021. But the other big thing that really changed things for me was listening to two people. That would be Chayada of Murcia and Endeavor. Chayada of Murcia's video on YouTube, How I Accidentally Became a Reactionary, and Endeavor's video, How I Became a Reactionary. Endeavor mentions these rape attacks that are being referenced in this book as one of the moments that really moved him rightward and away from his more basic conservative origins. Chayada of Murcia began as a libertarian like I did and then moved rightward. But Endeavor was a little different. He was a conservative that just moved to the right over time, and you can listen to his story if you want to know why. This idea that it was a conspiracy, this is sort of how Michael Malice is talking, that these stories were deliberately kept out of the press by the German government lest there be a racist reaction, is what happened. That is how it was. They didn't want people to get angry and upset about this, and so they downplayed it as much as possible. And Endeavor has pointed this out, rightly so, that shortly after this, as well as there's been several examples of this, whether there be rape attacks, but also bombings, Europe's response is very weak and cowed. They will do nothing, and then they'll come out and say, oh, we just want to extend a warm welcome to the Islamic community and make sure all of you guys feel safe, and we're not Islamic phobic. We stand in solidarity with the mosques, yada, yada, yada. And so that's the way that this actually is, despite what Michael Malice may pretend. Back to the text. If the alt-right could be defined by one slogan, it would be that demographics is destiny. When whites screw up a culture, they say, we get Sweden. When blacks do, we get the hell on earth that is Liberia. Yet despite dancing with this issue elsewhere in the book, Buchanan doesn't take the bait, pointing out that the past 500 years have been an endless chronicle of European peoples slaughtering one another, with World War I and II as climax to the horrors. And during that past half millennium, the great enemies of Western faith, culture, and civilization have come out of the West, end quote. This is Malice talking again. But Buchanan vacillates between identifying what the problem is per se. On the one hand, he seems to indulge in the naturalistic fallacy, equating that which is natural with that which is good. 600 Americans had died of AIDS in 1983. He, meaning Buchanan, writes, when the author urged the White House to address the medical crisis in a column that closed, the poor, homosexuals, they have declared war on nature, and nature is exacting an awful retribution. So it did. Hundreds of thousands have since died, end quote. So now this is Malice talking. Yet mortgages and cable television, to name two examples, are hardly natural. The other higher primates engage in polygamy. If evolution is a farce and ape comparisons invalid, as Buchanan would say, then one can point to King David's many wives and Jesus dying a virgin. If nature is the standard, then women should be ready to be mothers when they first get their period. So let's go into this just a little bit. He's trying to rip holes in Buchanan's argument. Buchanan is not saying in every single situation that which is natural is good. He's not some kind of like an anarcho-primitivist type. That's not true. What Buchanan is pointing at is not even a strict reading of how things used to be in Jewish culture. That's the important thing to point out. Buchanan is not holding to the time of Jesus Christ or to King David and saying that is the norm, nor would he say that we have to follow Jesus' example in terms of marriage, in terms of Jesus died a virgin, Jesus didn't have a wife. Buchanan is not saying we have to follow Jesus in that way. That's a claim that Malice is pointing to that Buchanan has not made. And it's also different to look at, for example, this is an example, medieval Europe versus biblical times during the time of King David, right? Because he mentions David's many wives. Buchanan does not make the claim, well, we need to just behave like Israel with King David. No, he points at something more akin to medieval Europe, maybe even post-Enlightenment Europe of the 17 and 1800s. I'm not really sure what he would point as being ideal, but definitely longer ago than 50 years ago. To be a paleoconservative, you have to be. So that is something that it seems that Malice is putting words in Buchanan's mouth. So that's pretty much enough when it comes to Buchanan. I've talked a lot about Buchanan in this book, and it's time to look at other things because I don't want to make this entire episode about, well, Michael Malice critiques Pat Buchanan and that's wrong. That's not exactly the point that I want to make here. So let's now go into something a little bit more fundamental. Maybe I should have started with this, but I really wanted to hit that first, just to show that Michael Malice is not really a conservative or even right-wing, I would argue. So in this book, and I'm going to find the chapter so you guys know, I think it's chapter 3. And yes, excuse me. Michael Malice defines what it means to be new right. And so he basically says that to be new right is to be opposed to progressivism. Now, let me be clear here because I would actually differ with this. I don't believe that being right-wing only merely is to be anti-progressive. What am I talking about? Well, an example of someone that's different than that would be Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck at times has said very base things, like when he said Obama was racist, and then he got fired off Fox News. He said Obama was racist against white people. Now, he ended up backpedaling years later and saying that wasn't the right thing to say. What I meant to say is that he wasn't part of American culture and was opposed to our values and hates this country. So I shouldn't have said he was racist, things like that. But I would argue that both things are true. You can be against American values and not understand what this country was built on and be racist against white people. And so, but that being said, so yeah, Glenn has said things that are really good, but he has this book, and I've read the whole book cover to cover, called Cowards, which is a very interesting book. He's got a whole chapter about George Soros, which that alone you should read. And in his book, he talks about how he is a libertarian, and a libertarian is an anti-progressive. And this, I will say, Glenn Beck overall hasn't really changed that much. So Glenn Beck formerly was a guy that was sort of part of that Never Trump movement, who said, "Oh, I'm a constitutionalist," sort of like Levin. They were both said, "We're too Republican for Trump. Trump is something else. Trump is wrong. He's racist, etc. He's stupid. Whatever. His supporters are stupid." And Glenn Beck ended up changing. But whenever you really look at or listen to his show, especially on foreign policy and even immigration, he's okay on the whole illegal immigration issue, but he's not really good on anything else. He's been pretty bad about war, and he's been put on a microphone and asked by Michael Malice, actually, does he regret supporting the Bushes? And he said no. So he's not particularly libertarian in any real sense, but for a while he was a little bit more libertarian, maybe. He probably is on, for example, surveillance and things like that. I would argue he probably still is. but he says a libertarian is anti-progressive, and I don't view libertarians as being part of the right. And Michael Malice said, well, they're part of the new right because they're all opposed to progressivism. And he points to someone like Gavin McInnes, who identifies as a libertarian, as being new right. And okay, Gavin McInnes calls himself a libertarian. Is he actually a libertarian issue by issue? I would need to have that discussion with him. I don't think he's particularly libertarian. I think he's sort of just like a basic conservative. I don't really see a whole lot else there. So anyway, to now get into some more of the book. So this was really, really funny. There's a part where Russia made a comment about the Pepe frog. And so let me read this here. There's a couple things actually here. Let me find it. Here we go. An official Russian government account tweeted out Pepe's image. This is pretty much the modern equivalent of Russia raising a swastika flag over the Kremlin, he decreed. And Michael Malice says, I would argue that even tweeting out a swastika wouldn't be the modern equivalent of raising a swastika flag over the Kremlin. Maybe, just maybe, the Russians hate the Nazis as much as we do, if not more. And maybe, just maybe, the Soviets sacrificed far more to defeat Hitler than we ever did, despite the patriotic mythology that claims otherwise. While I can see how Mr. Stroheim would think that the Nazis' siege of Leningrad is basically the equivalent of some collegiate anti-fascist hunger strike, I suspect that my former countrymen remember it a bit differently. So yeah, this is the funny thing about the left that is true, that Michael Malice is correct about, is that the left views them doing some hunger strike or some boycott as we are the new people toppling Adolf Hitler. I mean, they literally do. They view themselves as, these conservatives are going out and boycotting Target, and I'm going to keep targeting, keep targeting conservatives online, and then going to shop at Target. Look at me, I'm the modern anti-fascist. And these people are jokes. I mean, it's a complete joke there. So I wanted to share that little bit of humor with you. And so this is interesting. So something else that Michael Malice talks about is the war on fun. So I mentioned Gavin McInnes a bit ago. I used to be a huge fan of Gavin McInnes. I used to listen to almost every episode for a while. And Gavin McInnes has talked about the left has a war on fun, a war on humor. And Michael Malice actually looks at, and it looks like this is chapter 4. He looks at some of why. Here's this part of the book. Progressives often insist that certain subjects are off limits to humor. Rape or slavery or the Holocaust are all issues that currently make the list. Asking someone if they think rape is funny can only have one legitimate answer. But this misses the point entirely. No one thinks knocking on a door is funny. No one laughs when a chicken crosses the road or when a priest and rabbi walk into a bar. Not understanding a math problem would certainly not be taken as evidence that one is good at math. Yet it is almost unheard of for someone who dislikes a joke to recognize that maybe the problem lies with them and their poor sense of humor. First, I'm going to pause right there. Well said. That is exactly right. The left has no sense of humor. They cannot laugh at themselves. They have to laugh at jokes about the other side. If you laugh at them, they get so freaking ticked off, and it's hilarious. Back to the book. Few, if any, subjects are inherently funny in the same way that many ingredients are inherently a meal in and of themselves. Asking if rape is funny is more akin to asking if flour is food. No one actually eats flour. On the other hand, everyone has eaten it. Similarly, the more taboo a subject, the more exotic an ingredient, the more difficult it is to make it palatable, and some subjects will never be palatable for everyone, no matter how skillful the presentation. A joke is like a person. You can't dissect it and expect it to put it back together again and have it breathe. From the Holocaust to slavery, and even to crib death, there are jokes to be found. As of this writing, my friend is announcing her pregnancy by telling people she has a little Jew in the oven. So that's clearly Michael Malice has a Jewish friend who's saying that. Back to the text. When comedian Bonnie McFarlane roasted broadcaster Jim Norton by saying his show was so unlistenable that I'd rather hear my daughter drowning, there's little ground to criticize her as either a professional comic or a loving mother. A person who decrees that's not funny is in a position to define that for anyone, let alone everyone. So that is exactly right. Now, here's another thing. 2 months before she died in 2014, comedian Joan Rivers was challenged during a CNN interview about making jokes concerning subjects that seem off limits to a lot of people. Rivers is the woman who suggested to a reporter that they conduct their post 9/11 interview at Windows on the ground. Da-dunce. Life is very tough, Rivers snapped at the questioner, and if you can make something easier and funny, do it. Winston Churchill said if you can make someone laugh, you give them a vacation. And maybe you take the worst thing in the world, make it funny, and give them a vacation from horror. She then walked off the set, herself offended at the interviewer. Isn't that funny? I love that. The irony of you need to stop being offended and then walks off the set. But also she made her point. It was a mic drop moment, and I admire the performative nature of that. That's pretty hilarious. I like it a lot. So back to the text from Michael Malice. Rivers' mindset is very central to the Jewish tradition, especially the Eastern European Jewish tradition that she came from. The expression laughing to keep from crying is universally known and understood. I found this to be the case in other situations where people are escapees from horrible situations. One North Korean refugee I know said that The Hunger Games was her favorite book and movie, then jokingly asked how the author knew so much about life in the DPRK. So basically, yeah, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Back to the text. Another refugee managed to escape and go to high school in the United States. When his schoolmates were reminiscing about liking Pokemon as kids, he quipped, "Yeah, only instead of Pokemon, I watched my father star." Holy crap. Some people are just too funny, and I love the world that we live in where people are, at certain edges of the right wing, are starting to realize, okay, yeah, that's funny. People on the left, though, get so freaking ticked. Like, well, let me give an example. One time, a lady, I forget her name now, dang it, I could probably find out, had Michael Malice on and was talking to him because you may not know this, but Michael Malice has been to North Korea. And she was questioning him. And at one point, she was talking about Kim Jong Un. Yeah, I think it was Un. I don't think Il was still alive. Kim Jong Un, and she referred to him as a quote campy figure. And Michael Malice quipped back, "Isn't that kind of an unfortunate choice of words? Because work camps and things like that in North Korea." And the finality of what she had said, the horrible truth of what she had said, how she had phrased it, hit her. And Michael Malice said she looked like she wanted to kill herself. And it's just so funny because she just said the exact wrong thing about the wrong guy to the wrong person because Michael Malice is the only person who's going to take that and run with it. I mean, again, there's other comedians, I'm sure, but Michael Malice is unique because he's just got a dark sense of humor. He's very political. He had also just been in North Korea. So perfect. I freaking love it. Yeah, there's so many good jokes out there. Crap, there's another one that I thought of also, I think having to do with Michael Malice, and I can't think of it right now, but yeah, great moment. Let's see. So back to the text. It's not unreasonable to say that joking about someone's father dying, let alone starving, is not a ripe source for comedy, but it is universally understood that everyone grieves in different ways, and though grieving is through wisecracks and making other people uncomfortable is most certainly not common, neither is it, in the internet cliche, not okay. Thankfully, we live in a country where virtually no one will ever have to experience what my refugee acquaintance did. The idea that he is to be condemned for how he handles his grief, as opposed to being given carte blanche to react as he sees fit, is hard to defend. So yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I've heard people make jokes about their grandfather having Alzheimer's, and I'm not going to say to them, "You can't joke about your grandfather that way." I'm not going to do that. I'm not in that place. I definitely think that they should honor their grandpa or grandma. Sure, they should, but you can still honor your grandpa or grandma and then make a joke about something ridiculous that they've done in the past. That's not the same thing. In other words, if you're telling a story about your grandpa getting up in the morning and throwing his laundry into the front yard and saying or something about it and making a joke about it, like, I feel like the maid, I just cleaned up this mess, can we keep it clean for 10 minutes? Or some joke about by the time his children were out of diapers, he was in them, something like that. That is, I'm not going to go to that person and say, "You're disrespecting your grandpa." He's trying to make light of the situation and deal with grief because the person is obviously not in their right state of mind. So there's people who just want to be basically like joke police and say, "You can't joke about that." And it's very stupid. Back to this text. Laughter can obviously be a bonding experience. In 2017, I attended an AA meeting where my friend was commemorating her 10-year anniversary of being sober. One by one, the addicts who were also celebrating that day got up and told stories of the travails they had suffered. 8 years ago, I was in a mental institution, one man recalled. I was homeless. I was in the hospital. I was in jail. I was in the shelter. I did the whole tour. The room burst into laughter. It would be safe to say none of those 4 experiences is a laughing matter. Yet in this case, each one literally was, especially given the man's grateful caveat that the one stop on the tour he managed to avoid was death. In many cases, someone might see the humor in a joke or anecdote, in a joke or anecdote, but for valid personal reasons be unable to find something funny. Yet for the evangelical left, with humor as with everything else, if it's not for everyone, then it's not for anyone. The insistence is on universalism and inclusion regardless of context. This shrill admonition as to what is and isn't fair, grounds for humor, is precisely what fuels trolls. Loudly announcing that certain subjects will provoke a reaction, thereby turning audience into performer, lets trolls know exactly which buttons to press. The cost-benefit ratio could not be more favorable. In 2012, for example, Mountain Dew had a campaign to name their new flavor of soda. The public would vote, and then judges would pick from the top 10 names. It barely took any time for trolls to vote in large enough numbers to guarantee what the top 10 choices would be as unpalatable as the glowing poisonous beverage itself. The top result? Hitler did nothing wrong. That was the name of the soda. In the same way that Kaufman was not endorsing child abuse or even laughing at it, this option wasn't about Holocaust revisionism as much as it was about trolling a corporation. The company would be forced to react in some embarrassing way. Sure enough, Mountain Dew pulled the contest within 48 hours, tweeting out that Dub the Dew definitely lost to the internet. So that was pretty freaking funny. And so there's many such things in here about humor, and that's a way that the audience, I think, my audience, would benefit from this book. The left's war on humor. I love this because it's so true. The left worships universalism. One of the reasons they want America and Canada and other countries out west to be proposition nations is because they want everything to be for everyone, which isn't fair to the people that were already here, the people that came the right way and who are founding stock of this country. Like I said earlier, I've had some family that's been here 100 years, others that's been here far longer than that. That even dates back to the Revolutionary War against Britain. On the wrong side, but it's not here or there. Anyway, but yeah, excuse me, I don't know what you thought you heard. But yeah, I really would hold to that, which Michael Malice says, the idea that everything has to be universal. And if there's something that's not for everyone, then it shouldn't be for anyone. And that's really spot on for why they're mad about this. So something that I thought was interesting, let me read this right quick, was something that Vox Day, who I hadn't previously heard of until reading this book, so that was one way that I did benefit, said something about Ben Shapiro. So the closest thing to a manual for fighting the evangelical left comes from alt-right sci-fi author Vox Day. And he's calling him alt-right. I don't know if Vox Day actually calls himself alt-right. Day used to be colleagues with Ben Shapiro at the heretical right-wing website WND. Day wrote, "We corresponded a few times and were on friendly if distant terms. I mean, what do you talk about with a little kid whose idea of a good time is launching obvious rhetorical attacks at liberals? As he matured, he gradually began to question the ideas he was parroting and reached the point where he considered quitting the media game. I'll have to dig out the emails to figure out exactly what I told him, but if I recall correctly, I encouraged him to resist the temptation to become a media whore. I understood the allure as it was a poisoned apple that was also offered to me. Perhaps it was easier for me to turn it down since I was living in Europe and already established in the game development world. Ben, unfortunately, couldn't resist the apple or the easy way forward, writing whatever his backers told him to write. I haven't read much since he wrote those dreadful chicken crap columns in 2005, i.e. Shapiro's two Why Chicken Hawk argument is un-American pieces. So I don't know how much of what he writes is he genuinely believes now and how much he is still parroting. Of course, the human mind being the incredible rationalizing machine that it is, it's entirely possible that he has come to believe what he's been told to say. As is so often the case with the new right, Malice is writing this now, Day's contempt is as great for the conservative Shapiro as it is for the left. In 2016, Day wrote that Shapiro is not pro-American, he's a nationalist. He's just another nominal Jewish conservative. He's not pro-American, he's not a nationalist, he's just another nominal Jewish conservative who is a professional member of the mainstream media's Potemkin opposition and more devoted to fighting racism than big government. So Vox Day here, it's kind of like, well, where's the lie? I mean, whenever you look at books like this, I will say Vox Day, I'd never heard of him before reading this book. There's a lot of really good descriptions and things about people in here. But yeah, I really think that that's exactly right. Shapiro writes what he is told to write. And in this case, okay, you can argue, well, he has his own company now. Sure. But he writes that which is popular. You are not going to see him debate someone that is hard right like Ann Coulter ever again. He interviewed her. He tries to say he debated her. He interviewed her, asked her a series of questions, some of which may have been a little bit hard to answer, but it was not a debate. It was an interview. And he tries to point as that as saying, oh, well, look, I interviewed Ann Coulter. Okay, let's move on. I've done hard debates. I've done hard work. When really he needs to debate people that are more on the right than he is. He will never debate Pete Quinones. He will never debate Dark Enlightenment. He will never debate Thomas 777. He will never debate Jared Taylor. He will never debate Stefan Molyneux about immigration and war and things like that. He won't do it. And it's really unfortunate because the public would be well served to hear an exchange of ideas between a basic conservative and someone that is actually on the right, someone that is really right wing. And yeah, Stefan Molyneux is still sort of like an anarcho-capitalist type, but he's better than the alternative. I mean, he definitely is right when it comes to certain things on race and certain things on immigration, and definitely on war and the initiation of force. I mean, he's got a lot of things that are worth listening to and thinking about. And so, yeah, Ben Shapiro is not going to have those kind of discussions. He's going to go on basic, easy interviews. Think about it. The hardest one he went on was that one that he went on. I think it was called Good Morning Britain, where the same, oh man, the Scottish guy, I forget his name now. I can't remember for the life of me. I thought his name was Andrew. I can't remember. But Ben Shapiro actually hung up the call and got really mad because the guy was asking him some hard questions about his book that were not even particularly hard. And I really like the Scottish guy, by the way. I think he's an entertaining, hilarious guy, very grandfatherly and just a nice person. Although he's also a basic conservative. But he was asking some hard questions because that's his job. Is your job as a journalist, as someone who does these kind of interviews, to try and figure out exactly what's going on? And so, yeah, I think that was a bad look for Shapiro. But anyway, yeah, I really think that something that Michael Malice talks about, which is interesting. And one thing I will say, just kind of in closing, I'm not going to go too much more into this book because I want you guys to read it. And again, you're not going to get as much out of it if you're my age or older, but you're still going to get something out of it if you're not familiar with, say, Fox Day and things like that. Is Michael Malice is, at the end of the day, he is an anarchist. He doesn't pretend to be otherwise. And one thing that he says as an example is the people that regulate the radio waves and says, oh, well, they're censorious. There's certain words you can't say with, like, swear words, saying the F word, things like that. He says, but if Amazon or FedEx were in charge, private companies, then it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Well, it's kind of like, to quote the great John Jafari, aka JonTron, that one didn't age quite so well, considering the fact that Amazon has bought the Washington Post and is continuing to buy other things. And these companies are moving in a very, very woke direction. And so I have no faith that if Amazon or another company, a big one, bought the airwaves, instead of having the feds regulate the airwaves, these private companies did. In my view, it would depend on who owned it. If Elon Musk bought the radio waves, and I don't really care about swear words being censored. You can't say to me that there's just no difference between someone saying F you effing F, which is actually a shirt up in New York City, that there's no difference between that and someone saying some politically incorrect position. Like, I don't think we should go to war with Yemen or Qatar, or I like President Donald Trump, or I want to deport millions of people who came into this country illegally and stop all immigration. Things like that are not the same thing as a bunch of swear words. And so, is there certain times that radio stations are probably censoring political opinions? I'm sure that there are. But talk radio leans to the right. Again, basic right, just kind of like basic conservatism. But it's better than it could be. And if Elon Musk bought them, would things get better as far as overall? Would things get less censorious of political opinions? Maybe. That's kind of a mixed bag over on Twitter. So it's kind of hard to say. But with that being said, I have no faith that things would get better if someone besides Musk bought it. If someone was a left-winger and bought it, like Bloomberg, then that would get worse, way worse. So Michael Malice is wrong on that and says something that really didn't age well. And so I think that is a good summary of the book. I haven't really covered all of the content, and that's on purpose. I've given more my general thoughts and read specific parts that I thought this book was really insightful on. So you really need to read it for yourself. As far as how would I rate it, I don't do, by the way, like out of 10. I usually do things as from school, either A through F. I would give the book a B overall. I wouldn't give it an A. I would give The Reactionary Mind by Michael Warren Davis and other books that I've read, like Annals of the Stupid Party, an A. But I would give, Michael Malice a B. I wouldn't necessarily give him a B plus. I would just put it as a solid B. It's definitely not below a B. So I think you should read it. I think you should definitely put it on your reading list. It's not like you need to drop this and read this right now, but I recommend it. And so I appreciate all of you guys listening to me talk about this book. We've had a really, really good podcast episode, and I'm sure that you guys are going to enjoy the next few ones that I do. Make sure, if you are not already, that you go to Substack and are following me. It's really easy. It's thefogandthewhirlwind.substack.com/subscribe. Same as the title of this YouTube channel, or if you're on Spotify, listening on Spotify, same as the Spotify account. The Fog and the Whirlwind.substack.com/subscribe. Go there and follow me. That's my base of operations. If you do become a paid supporter, you get exclusive content. You also get admission into the private supporters of the Fog and the Whirlwind group chat. Make sure you guys are following me on social media. There's links in the description of YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Odyssey. So make sure you're doing that. I'm pretty easy to find. X or Twitter, whatever we're calling it now, is @fogandwhirlwind. Instagram is also Fog and Whirlwind. Telegram is t.me/fogandwhirlwind. Thanks again, everybody. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next episode. Everybody, have a great evening and take care.